I'm Steve Roach. I'm going to break from this tradition. I will tell you that I am going to use PowerPoint, but I don't see anything up here. Is there a... Oh, there it is over there. Okay. Yeah, the only bad thing about my PowerPoint is it takes away from that fantastic drawing of this conference that I know Ned was very excited to share with me. This is the second time I've appeared in front of this conference. I think the last time was maybe, I don't know, 11 or 12 years ago. It's terrific to be back and give you my nickel on what I think is one of the toughest issues that the world is facing now, this escalating conflict between the United States and China. And the title of my presentation is not an accident, no pun intended. It's also the title of a new book that I have coming out in November. The relationship itself has been a troubled relationship, quite honestly, from the start. It began, the modern day U.S.-China relationship began rather innocently, sometime in the second half of the 1970s. Two troubled nations, China in the aftermath of the Cultural Revolution, the United States in the grips of a wrenching stagflation, needed new recipes for economic growth. And they found that they could offer each other something that would help them in achieving that result. The U.S. and its income-constrained consumers needed cheap, increasingly high-quality goods to make ends meet. And China, a nation that was struggling in the grips of poverty, backward, largely agricultural sector, needed a new dynamic in producing low-cost goods for American consumers, was a very comfortable and powerful antidote to its own growth problems. They came together in this marriage of convenience. The ties deepened dramatically in the 90s and the 2000s, especially in the aftermath of China's WTO accession. The marriage of convenience morphed into a full-blown economic codependency. Both nations needed each other to sustain their economic growth and development. But now, as is the case in the study of human pathology, codependency can lead to conflict if it's not managed well. And in the past 5 years, that's exactly what's happened. The trade war, the tech war, and now the early stages of a new Cold War. My thesis is that the trajectory of conflict escalation would not have happened were it not for the false narratives that both nations have embraced with respect to each other. I think the U.S. is just as guilty of that as China is. So it is the conflict that didn't have to happen. I highlight on this page here a few of my favorite false narratives on both sides that I go into in great detail in my new forthcoming book. Just to illustrate one in the upper right of this slide, there is so much focus on China as being the source of America's large and growing trade deficit that what is often lost sight of is the the fact that last year, for example, and virtually every year for the past decade, we run trade deficits with over 100 countries. It's a multilateral problem. It's an outgrowth of our savings problem. And this is the economist in me. When nations don't save but want to grow, they borrow surplus savings from abroad. And they attract attract the foreign capital that allows them to borrow that savings. They run deficits with many, many countries. And so if you don't address your savings problem, and we have not done that in the United States, you can close down trade with one of your trading partners, like we've done with China and Trump's tariffs, or attempted to do. But that piece of the deficit will go elsewhere, and we don't seem to be willing to grasp that. A number of other false narratives that I will not go into, that I address in the book. One of them is I just mentioned briefly, the dreaded fear of Huawei, China's leading technology company, as posing a dire threat to America, the innovator. I've looked carefully at all the evidence that's been assembled about Huawei's so-called allegations of using the back door on its telecommunications products, especially as it rolls out 5G telecom around the world, as the leading provider of 5G telecom. There are one, maybe two instances when Huawei has broken the rules there, but they're not with respect to 5G, and they all took place a long, long time ago. I worry in particular that we're fixating on Huawei as the Trojan horse in our innovations challenges that we face in the United States, but losing sight of the heavy lifting that we have stopped doing with respect to focusing on innovation through research and development, investing in higher education. China is guilty of its own set of false narratives. There's no question about it. Any nation that supports a state-sponsored system of censorship, as China does, of course, is a breeding ground for false narratives, and government censors, of course, control and curate the debate on literally everything. And so truth is elusive in China. I make the provocative point that I'm certain most of you will disagree with, that while we don't have state-sponsored censorship in the United States, we do have rampant information distortion amplified by social media. I wish I could have been around to hear Jonathan Haidt talk about that, but I think the polarized information distortion that continues to exist today in the United States, with 70% of one political party still believing in the lie of a rigged and stolen election, speaks for itself. The framework that I use in laying out this story is to spend the bulk of my book on going through false narratives, both on the U.S. side and on the China side, with respect to one another. And then I bring them together in a concluding series of chapters where I pit the narratives against one another, the framework of a dueling false narrative that has led to this escalation of conflict. And conflict escalation is something I worry about a lot because it has taken on a dynamic of its own. And when it is turbocharged by the high-octane fuel provided by social networks, it doesn't take much of a spark to ignite that fuel into a conflict that goes beyond the one that we are currently experiencing. And I worry about Taiwan, especially in the aftermath of Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taipei this August. I worry about the human rights issues that are boiling over in the Xinjiang province. Not that I'm taking sides on these issues, but these issues bring together levels of confrontation that in a regime of accidental conflict could be ignited very easily. The issue that I want to just focus on at the end before I turn to questions is there are a lot of books actually that talk about the U.S.-China conflict. Mine will only be the latest in a large number of efforts to do that. But I'm hopeful that what is different about the book that is about to come out is that I focus a lot on the idea of conflict resolution. How do we resolve this conflict? And it's an especially difficult question to answer when no one in our, certainly our political system, in the U.S. Congress or the White House, is willing to take a chance and attempt to engage Chinese officials in a constructive dialogue in resolving our differences. There's legislation after legislation that will continue to escalate the conflict, and there are proposals being made by the Biden administration to tighten the noose on China. The most unfortunate example I can point to is the first day of the Biden administration on January 20th of 2021, when President Biden, I think, signed 14 executive orders that countermanded most of the most unpopular moves of his predecessor, including stopping construction of the border wall in Mexico, ending the Muslim travel ban, rejoining the Paris Agreement on climate change, rejoining the World Health Organization. He had a terrific opportunity to roll back the tariffs on China that the Trump administration had imposed that had accomplished nothing. But he chose not to do so. And now, of course, the window is slammed shut because any conciliatory efforts that the administration might address toward China would be hugely criticized by his own party, let alone the loyal opposition. So, my ideas on conflict resolution is the first step cannot even commence until some semblance of trust is restored between the two nations. And the best place to start building, or hopefully rebuilding trust, is through focusing on global issues of mutual importance for both nations. And I tick off three that I highlight in the book. Climate change, where there's been a slight amount of joint progress. Global health, where there's been no progress, just a lot of finger pointing on who's to blame for COVID-19, and cybersecurity. Any one of those areas, progress brings two conflicting parties together and begins to establish the mutual trust that is required to tackle the tougher issues between us. So, 3 quick steps, and then I'll stop for questions. 1, end this ridiculous idea that the Trump administration offered, the so-called Phase 1 trade deal, that we can fix America's trade deficit by forcing China to buy more product and address the bilateral trade imbalance between us and China. Phase 1 failed from the start. It didn't work. You can see the graph on the upper right. The U.S. overall trade deficit with over 100 countries gotten wider as a share of GDP. The Chinese piece, the red line on the bottom, went down, but the blue line, the trade deficit with other nations got larger. That's what economics would tell you. When you don't solve your savings problem, and you squeeze one partner, that piece goes to others. And in the last few years, it's gone to Vietnam, Taiwan, India, Korea, even Canada. So the idea of Phase 1 is, of course, it would set the stage for the next phases to come. And unfortunately, the new U.S. Trade Representative, Catherine Tai, continues to believe that China should be held accountable for what it did not deliver in Phase 1. Phase 1 thinking is a recipe for continued conflict and little progress, if at all, in resolving the trade issues between us. Step 2 is to recognize that as opposed to the zero-sum thinking of a bilateral trade deal, we should attempt to address the structural differences between us on issues such as innovation, technology transfer, subsidies to state-owned enterprises, labor practices, environmental issues, and the like. The best way to address structural issues for me is to focus on growth opportunities that can be gained from opening up both markets through a bilateral investment treaty. In the Obama administration, toward the end, we were about 95% of the way done in completing a market-opening bilateral investment treaty that would expand growth opportunities between the two countries. Trump came into office, as you know, and anything that Obama had done, he said no, and so suspended the bilateral investment treaty. Negotiations have gotten nowhere since then. It would be wise and prudent, but politically difficult for Joe Biden to reopen those negotiations. But I would urge him or his successor to do so. And then third and finally, the structure of engagement between our two nations, I dare say, with all due respect to those who are attempting to do that, is pathetic. We used to have once or twice yearly big summits called strategic and economic dialogues, or some variation on that, those names. And then again, Trump, in his infinite wisdom, canceled that program altogether after one feeble attempt in 2017. Now all we have are periodic phone calls or Zoom meetings on a leader-to-leader basis. We need something more, we need something better. This relationship is too important to be left to episodic encounters at the leader-to-leader level. So what I propose in my book is the establishment of a permanent organization, for lack of a better term, called a U.S.-China Secretariat, comprised of staff of an equal number of Chinese and American professionals working on all aspects of the relationship, from trade and technology to human rights and climate, located in a neutral jurisdiction called Switzerland, and empowered to do 4 specific things. 1, frame the relationship by doing joint research off of a joint database, in other words, sharing facts, ending the idea of alternative facts that both nations can pull to support their point of view, producing joint policy white papers that are presented to their respective governments to move the relationship forward. Secondly, convening experts to address tough problems, not solving the problems themselves, but convening those who are equipped to do that. Best example, outbreak of COVID-19. Rather than fight over the source of the virus, as we continue to do, despite scientific evidence to the contrary, bring both nations together on the same page, sharing data and sharing public health practices to address it. Thirdly, there's an outreach function comprised of conferences, publicly available database, and certainly a website that tells you everything you need to know about the activities of the Secretariat and its various proposals and activities. And then finally, there is an oversight and compliance function, which is very important, because agreements that are repeatedly reached by the U.S. and China, or the U.S. and any nations, oftentimes get drawn into questions. There's violations of the agreements. The WTO, for example, has a well-established dispute resolution mechanism that is now dormant because of America's intransigent stance on WTO reform. The new Secretariat should be empowered with a monitoring and compliance function to track existing and new agreements like a bilateral investment treaty, and also serve as a first stop for disputes. So that's my plan. I'm not saying it's going to work. You may have a better idea. Let me hear from you if you do. But it's an effort in, I think, an important direction. And as Alan did, I'll skip this and just tell you, if you want to buy the book, you can order it right now from your chair. Thank you very much. Happy to take your questions. And please, no, I have 3 questions, just 1 question each.
Okay, so first of all, thank you so much, Professor. So my name is Zi. I'm a first-year international student, come from China. And I really like your presentation, though, because I really hope the relationship between China and the United States could be better and better. Because right now, the policy facing to our international students is not very friendly. And in my opinion, I think this dueling is existing and even more, because we see the trade war and other stuff. And I think the United States government just showing aggressiveness recently. Like you mentioned, the Paul Pelosi visit Taiwan last month was in a very sensitive time. And also I think whether it's Biden government or Trump government, you can mention China almost every day, especially during elections. So, I think the China, at least the Chinese government and Chinese people is now really want to have this kind of competition with the United States, at least now right now though. So my question will be, do you think this kind of dealing between the United States and China is meant to happen? And do you think the reason why this dealing is happening is because the United States want to remain the dominance position as the one and the only superpower in the world? Thank you.
Look, that's a question that I do address in the book. The United States wants to stay strong and China wants to become strong. But the fact is that both nations are more vulnerable than they are willing to admit. And out of that vulnerability, they concoct these false narratives that make the other look as if they are the aggressor and treating the other unfairly. I take your point. I made the point that the Biden administration has been very aggressive, surprisingly so, following the Trump administration. But I'm not going to let China off the hook. I mean, China has done a lot of things that are equally aggressive. I would just cite one to you, and that is on February 4th, Xi Jinping invited Vladimir Putin to Beijing on the eve of the Winter Olympics and had the audacity to sign an unlimited partnership agreement with a pariah state literally 20 days before they were to invade an innocent country in violation of China's own deeply held principles of peaceful coexistence. Who's to blame for that? The United States has no responsibility in that, and that has created a huge problem for China. So both nations are, I think, guilty of taking actions that are making it very difficult for the world community, let alone the United States, to embrace China as a partner as it once did. Other questions?
Yes, I'm Giovanni Tria from Italy, University of Rome. I totally share your approach, but my question is, you focus, of course, on the bilateral relationship between United States and China. But you know, the cost of this conflict is spreading around the world. Look just at inflation caused also by the fragmentation of the markets. I read on your slides about an idea for an agreement on investment, and I wanted to remind that the comprehensive agreement on investment is designed between China and Europe has been blocked also, as all of us we know, for the American pressure. Then my question is, do you think that we have to work not only, of course, on all the points, the issues that you raised for the bilateral relationship, we have to work for a new Bretton Woods agreement, because what we need is really a new large trade agreements between all the current big economic area on trade, monetary system, security, etc. Thanks.
Yeah, like I say, you make an important point. You know, the idea that we could fix problems country by country on a bilateral basis is very much at odds with all the cross-border connectivity that exists in a multilateral world. I would not be optimistic, though, on the world coming together to do a new Bretton Woods agreement, however important that might be to resolve these problems that have been boiling over for years, country by country, on a bilateral basis. I do think, however, that two countries like the United States and China can do a much better job of doing of addressing the conflict between them in a multilateral context. Your point on the comprehensive investment agreement between the EU and China is a good point, is an example of how a bilateral investment treaty can in fact work to open markets in two large economies. I take issue with your point that it was put on ice because of American pressure. I think the Europeans are dealing with their own set of anti-China political pressure as well. But I think the CAI, the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, is an example of an enlightened approach toward using market opening initiatives to deal with structural problems to create positive sum growth opportunities in two large economies. We need to do more of that. A bilateral investment treaty can do that in the United States. I see the zero there. Do you want me to keep going or stop? You tell me.
Thank you, Mr. Roach, for your presentation. I'm also an international student coming from China here studying in Columbia. So my question is regarding sort of the political basis for the pragmatic sort of cooperation that you have pointed out. So it seems to me that there's sort of underlying political distrust between the two nations that has prevented them from acting on very pragmatic cooperation, such as climate change. It seems to me, for example, in the case of Miss Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, that there's sort of misunderstanding on the two sides. On the China side, they're saying this is sort of a provocation of future conflict, and on the U.S., they're saying this is sort of a support for a kind of a democratic regime on the ground. Do you think there is such thing as a political basis for pragmatic cooperation in the case of cooperation between these two countries? And do you think that's an important thing going forward for the cooperation that you have mentioned in your speech? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your question. I don't mean to be flippant in responding to what you said, but I have a hard time linking together two concepts in your question, politics and pragmatic. They don't connect. Our politicians are very self-serving, and that's true, I think, in both nations. But I just point out two aspects of the political clash that have left me very pessimistic in terms of where this relationship is going. One, this idea that was amplified by former President Trump, that the large and, at that point, record trade deficit between the United States and China had destroyed American companies, had damaged American communities, and was a killer in terms of jobs and innovation. That formed the basis of the allegations that were then seriously raised by his trade representative, Robert Lighthizer, in a famous Section 301 complaint that was released in March of 2018, that then sparked the tariffs that are still in place today. In my book, which I know many of you have ordered while we're speaking here, I go through the allegations piece by piece.
Should be free copy.
And they are not substantiated by evidence. But the American public believes the allegations, and China is responsible for the anxiety they feel. On the other side of the equation, Xi Jinping, 10 years ago, coming up in November, espoused the famous Chinese dream, a dream of rejuvenation, nationalistically focused on never allowing the great Chinese nation to be contained ever again. And the U.S. has unfortunately set in motion a mindset that has engendered fears of Chinese containment. Nancy Pelosi is only part of that. But a lot of it is also China's own insecurity as a major power, as a growing and proud nation. And that, unfortunately, clouds the politics of everything that China sees with respect to the United States, and is a breeding ground for China's own large number of false narratives that is leading it down the path of confrontation with America. China can do better, we can do better. Unfortunately, politicians like confrontation better than resolution, because confrontation is what keeps them in power and gets them reelected.
We do one more question.
Just one more
question.
here. Sorry.
Thank you. You mentioned the Ukrainian war.
He's already had a question, right?
Yes, it's a
So, I
question.
mean, there's all these people screaming over here. I think you have great questions, but I want to just be fair. If we're doing one more question, give it to somebody else.
No,
Okay.
first question.
No, that's my first
It's a quick question.
by the way. But I have no problem if somebody else wants to raise questions.
No, but it's your first question.
Okay,
Okay,
okay.
I'm sorry.
Great.
Do whatever you want.
So, I'm Luigi, by the way, I'm Luigi Bonatti, University of Trento, Italy. So you mentioned the Ukrainian war, and you talk about the need of, the urgent need of rebuilding a constructive relationship between U.S. and China. Now, I like to have your opinion, your prediction. Do you think that perhaps this new start between the U.S. and China could be a role of China in mediation of the truce, or I don't want to talk about an agreement, but at least a truce in the Ukrainian-Russian war? Do you think that is possible?
I think it's possible.
Likely, or
I think it's
what?
possible, but unfortunately unlikely. Xi Jinping has had ample opportunity to exercise leadership and statesmanship in bringing his new unlimited partner to his senses. He has refused to do that. That to me is an abrogation of his responsibility as a great global statesman. He aspires to make China a great power and to sit at the table with other great leaders. He made a mistake in joining with Vladimir Putin. It was a horrible mistake, possibly his greatest blunder of his leadership. He's had ample chance to correct it and to bring Putin, I won't say to his senses, but to shift his direction, and he has not done that. And I think, honestly, that the United States and the rest of the world should put far more pressure on Xi Jinping to deliver his, or to shift the direction of his partner. And if China doesn't do it, then they should begin to face some of the same consequences that Russia has faced with sanctions imposed by the West. Wait, just quickly, scream it out.
Quick question. Taiwan, what are China's intentions in your view, and what should America's policy be?
China's intentions are obvious: reunification, and their intentions are to do it over an indefinite, strategically ambiguous period of time, and to do it peacefully. But what worries me in that regard is, go back to the point on Putin in prosecuting this insane war in Ukraine. His argument, his logic, is that we in the West, through NATO expansion, forced him to do it. I mean, it's pure nonsense. But that's his point of view. But aren't we guilty of doing the same thing with China by containing China on many fronts, including its long-term goal that we agreed upon in the United States under the guise of the one China policy. U.S. containment of China, to me, has a striking analogy with the insane logic that Vladimir Putin is offering in support of his prosecution of the war in Ukraine.